I think our schemes are necessary, would be one word. And I think they need to be more adaptable. And probably to a point I made earlier, is they actually need to be more focused on and aware of what strengthens injured worker resilience.
Thank you for joining me in the studio.
It's a pleasure.
Now you're hot off the stage. Well done. Beautiful presentation. It was scheme design and performance and executive perspective. All right. Very interesting. So, and you raised this question, Michael. It was my very first question too. Is the scheme design fit for purpose?
I would argue that much of our scheme design is able to be fit for purpose. It's about the way in which it's applied. That said, there are elements which no doubt will require evolution, and again, it can depend upon where you're at in a scheme. I'm operating in a scheme that's had its legislation changed as recently as 10 years ago, which if you put that in the context of some of the other schemes, Jason spoke earlier about the scheme that they had previously been operating in, which was designed in the mid-'80s. So that's a long time ago now. So, and that said, some of what's been taken into account with respect to the scheme design we're operating in has modernised, if you could say that way, or put it that way. Yeah, that's how I'd describe it.
So if the design is okay, my interpretation of what you just said, but the application's a bit skewed, isn't that a problem with the design?
Yeah, well, it's a good point in that sense. So I would argue that it sometimes comes down to then culture in terms of what our expectations are that we place in and around our schemes and how we go about the implementation. That can create a lot of the change, not all of it, but a lot of the change that we need for our schemes to be able to meet the needs of those they're set up to serve. And if we're listening more and if we're prepared to can I say, have a risk appetite around where we're prepared to take risk within the boundaries that we have, and that's what we should do as insurers. We should understand risk and what those appetites are. Then often there is leeway for us to be able to take on a bit of that risk in those areas where we might not have historically met need. But the reason we haven't met it necessarily is often because we just didn't listen. And sometimes we've got that if we can apply in a meaningful way that bespoke approach that I think our schemes can give us some license to apply, we can achieve that, at least at an aggregate level. We speak about our presentation being an executive perspective, and sometimes that means we're not dealing with things at that sort of almost very granular claim by claim level, but so much of I'll say the philosophy of what I'm speaking to then needs to be applied at that claim level to achieve at a scheme level far more broadly that broader societal expectation.
Now I'll get back to this whole listening business and our ability to do so. But Jason, same question for you. Is the scheme design fit for purpose?
Yeah, so look, I absolutely echo the points that Michael's made as well. What I'd say though, just as an observation for me personally, is that these schemes are largely retrospective. And so as a result, we're behind we tend to be behind where the curb might be for community sentiment and just behaviors. And an example being is sort of after the pandemic. The pandemic has shaken a lot of things up in terms of people's behaviors, the choices they now make, the reflections that they're having about themselves, their lives, their careers, and there's no way that I think the schemes can actually keep up with that pace and change. And so to Michael's point, the South Australian scheme I think probably represents one of the more modern schemes, and that was some 10 years ago. And the thing is you've also got to be careful. The thing I've learned in these schemes is no sudden movements. The schemes have a big life cycle, and so they need at least a good 3 to 5 years to work through a cycle. And that's because of the heavy financials, the actuarial modeling that goes with it, very complex stuff. And so you actually can't constantly move. And I think human nature and human sentiments and the community's behaviors are changing constantly with AI, the advent of technology, social media, and all of these sorts of things. And so as schemes, we could be in some real dire straits if we were constantly trying to modernize and redesign things. So long answer to your question is I think they're as well designed as we can, and we try to retrofit them to meet today's challenges without breaking too much of the fundamentals that the actuaries use to continue to ensure that the scheme is on a viable path. If we be changing goalposts here, then the actuaries are going to change the numbers, and then that's going to create a whole raft of unpleasant numbers for decision makers. And then I think when you have governments starting to get involved in making decisions, you may not get decisions that are as sustainable for the future, because they may be more short term because of pressures, of budgetary pressures or public community pressures. So I guess there's a lot of stuff that ties into why the schemes are designed the way they are, and there's a reticence to be, chopping and changing them frequently.
So I'll get back. Thank you for that. And it leads me to another question, but I have to get back to this one first. When we speak from the context of personal experience and within the construct of the environment in which we live, right? So when we listen, are we missing something because they're not telling us something? You with me? So we're listening.
Keep talking.
It's a bit like, with the kids, and they say, I want to travel to America to see Disneyland. And the context of that is everything's possible. But the reality is mum and dad are working 2 jobs just to try to get them through school, right? So listening is all well and good, but the reality is very different.
So often I think that's about the conversation then, because you can listen, but ultimately I think the art of being able to meet people's needs is often to then distill it down to what are the needs that are in there, and I'm putting the needs in inverted commas there, because sometimes that's not always what's first said, and that's why the conversation needs to unpack that, because part of what we've found to be a really important part of trying to actively manage a scheme in South Australia, and certainly my experience that dates back sort of well prior to my time within that scheme, is that it's really important to be able to contextualise whatever it is that's being put to you. And when you have those conversations, you can build relationships with those stakeholders, whether they be from the perspective of those representing the interests of injured people, workers, those who are representing employers, those who might be representing different provider groups who provide services within that scheme. You can or if you just look at it superficially, you think, how the heck are you ever going to get these things to actually gel to the point where you can actually form a cohesive unit that meets people's needs? But the reality is, when most people, if you engage with them in such a way and you build a relationship and some of the trust that Greg Tweedley was speaking to previously, then you can start to get some sort of mutual respect for the different perspectives people have. And then you start to work out, well, what is it that we can actually achieve as a group, but by understanding the different perspectives others have, noting that we're probably never going to get everything that all of the respective groups are looking for, but if I could say that there are the critical elements which relate to providing people with the support they really need to get back on their feet, we often can and are able to. And it can take away so much of the noise that allows us to then focus on the business of the purpose of empowering and supporting people to get back on with their lives.
So is there a role in scheme design, Jason, given the beast that we're dealing with, or the machinations of the various parties of which you speak, is there a role for disruptors?
Absolutely. And I think it's a critical role. And this is part of that healthy tension that I mentioned, is sometimes you need disruptors to almost wake you up to the fact that, we're actually out of balance. We've been on autopilot here. We've walked into this next issue. And unless you've got some sort of disrupting mechanism there, you will just continue to sleepwalk into the challenge. So And I think to that point you made about listening as well, I think part of listening is you're understanding, you're learning where expectations are. Because in these schemes, you have to constantly gauge where expectations are and then reset those expectations. So I think that's where a disruptor is constantly listening for where people are at, or where ministers are at, or where the sector might be at, and to be gauging, is that about right? Well, no, okay, we're going to need to intervene here, or we're going to need to highlight a challenge that we're going to have to focus on. And when it comes to disrupting and highlighting the challenge, one of the things I've sort of learnt through painful experience, I'm sure Michael's done the same, is the fact that you need to make sure that you've got all your partners on side with you. There can't be any doubts. There can't be any wavering of resolve, because it can be really tough once you've gone down this path of having to correct or reform a scheme, and you need to have partners that are with you, that are through thick and thin. They're going to see it through, because it's hard. And we saw experiences through our reform process where we were disrupting. Disruption was deemed too much, and so we had to come back to a sort of halfway point, or a compromise point, which is where we are today, and that's fine, and we'll work with that. But what it showed me is that sometimes you need to be prepared that even though you're disrupting, the compromise has to constantly be a factor in your mind, because some parties are just not prepared to go as far as you think it might need to go.
But also we need to be prepared in what we're hearing today, and we'll continue to hear throughout the conference. We've got to be prepared to partner with new partners. We would never have partnered with an AI provider 5 years ago. There's new medical partners, there's new rehab partners, new technology partners. So there's both of that, isn't it? It's taking the people along for the ride and bringing new people in.
And I would argue it's, again, there's those partners who can offer, I'll say, those relatively new skill sets or organizational or scheme level capabilities. But almost, I would argue that part of what is a really critical part of those conversations I was referring to earlier was that there is a far greater or higher expectation. We talk about societal expectations that those of us who are responsible for administering schemes are going to be transparent and engaging with the people who are impacted by them. It's just, maybe I'm not sure that it ever was cutting it, that they were left out, but more and more so, we are finding better ways to be able to engage, so that when we get to that ultimate decision-making point, where sometimes our political masters it is who have to make the decisions on scheme design, are feeling a degree of comfort that whilst, as I spoke of before, not every group of interested parties' needs are going to be met in their entirety, but the fundamental elements are, and that the groups such as ourselves who can actually, or the people such as ourselves who can help inform those respective groups and bring them together, will have had those conversations, will have been open and transparent about it. Because one thing that has changed, and no doubt for the better from my perspective, is that society will call, I'm finding difficult to find the polite way to describe it now, but I'm going to say a bit of BS when they hear it. So, we need to make sure that if we say that we've genuinely engaged and we've collaborated and we've listened, we better have. Otherwise, it'll get called out, and whatever it is that we're coming up with, a solution will be worse for it, and it won't actually stand the test of time.
And speaking of the test of time, in a few words, the future of our schemes?
So,
what's it look like?
I'll let Jason
Okay, here you go, Jace. You go.
So it's a great question. The future of our schemes. I think in a few words, I think our schemes are necessary. Would be one word. And I think they need to be more adaptable. And probably to a point I made earlier, is they actually need to be more focused on and aware of what strengthens injured worker resilience. And the reason I say that is because I think in the past we have created schemes that have not quite been clear on what we should be covering or shouldn't be covering, and we probably have accidentally taken away people's actual resilience. And ultimately, that's what makes people stronger and helps them return to work better and deal with adversity, is how we are strengthening and feeding their resilience rather than actually accidentally taking
and disempowering them.
If I was to answer that question, I would say that a big part of being effective is meeting that societal demand for people to have agency in I guess, their lives and have control in and around that. And so whatever it is that the evolution of our schemes look like, it needs to be able to cater for a bespoke response where people can actually have that agency in how can the scheme work for them, but also be given the guidance that they need to be able to, traverse or navigate their way through what that scheme can provide for them, but navigate their way through being the word, so that they can actually get to the other side of it. Because people being stuck in our schemes for excessive periods of time, excepting for those who are really severely injured who will rely on them for their lives, but for all intent and purpose, all others, they're better off being able to find their way through these schemes because we know they have better life outcomes when they're not so dependent on them.
So I'm going to throw in a few more words. Challenging, positive, and very fulfilling careers in our industry for the people who don't lose sight of the reason why it exists, which I think you spoke about at the start. Don't lose sight of the reason why we're here. And you'll hear that. You hear that a lot through the conference. Absolutely. Very passionate people.
An incredibly important part of the employee value proposition. We're talking about attracting and retaining people to our industry.
Yeah.
If we don't give people an opportunity to be able to engage with and understand that purpose, about why we're here, not what each of the schemes do and how they go about it, why, we'll lose them.
Exactly.
And I think, Michael and I probably between us got maybe 50, 60 years in this industry, 20 plus years each, and made a career of it. And it's a great industry, and you get to help. You get to help people. You get to, so it's very fulfilling, and it's the challenge that, apart from my kids getting me up in the morning, it's the challenge of what the scheme's going to be able to do today and what are we doing about it. So it's an absolutely fulfilling career, fulfilling industry, and you're helping people in the process as well. So I think, what could be bad about that?
Exactly. So thank you very much, both of you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Will do. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.